Mayoral Memo with Matthew Dickerson from Dubbo Regional Council.
In Wagga, we're talking about this 3D printing technology, and there's a lot of interest from local councillors about investing in it. It was something that seemed like it might be a long way away, but then I see that all of a sudden Dubbo has decided to lead the way, and you've got a toilet block opened this week.
Indeed, and it's interesting that you say all of a sudden. It's actually been a fairly long process to get to where we've arrived at now. It started earlier last year when one of our councillors brought forward a notice of motion to reserve blocks of land in a future housing estate specifically for 3D printed housing. And this was a part of the solution to try and generate more housing. Dubbo has a housing issue the same as many places across regional New South Wales have in terms of not enough housing. Lots of people want to be in Dubbo. I'm sure lots of people want to move to Wagga as well. And so we need more housing to accommodate those people. But it's hard to find enough tradespeople. It's hard to get the buildings built quick enough. So it all started with that reservation of some 4 blocks of land. And that went through council, resolved by council to go forward with that. And that was going to be an estate that would be developed sometime around the middle of this year. So it wasn't going to happen immediately. On the back of that, it was quite fascinating because we received a number of phone calls from organisations across the state and in fact internationally as well. So we ended up doing approximately 9 video calls with different companies who said they wanted to come and start doing 3D printing in Dubbo immediately. And we had to explain to them that this resolution of council was relating to a future release of land, and there were going to be those 4 blocks of land dedicated specifically to 3D printed housing. But there was nothing stopping them coming in. And actually then we investigated it further and we found there was something stopping them coming in and doing it immediately because the planning laws in the state probably weren't quite up to speed with 3D printing as a technology for building. So our planning staff had to go and do a bit of work with the state government to just make sure that when we finally got to the stage where we were going to have an application in from someone to do a 3D printed house, we actually had the ability to approve that house and actually let someone say, yes, you can go ahead and build. So that was all happening in the background. We got through the planning part of that process, and the estate that we wanted to do these 3D printed houses in wasn't quite finished. And it came up to an amenities block that was due for replacement. It had been put in the budget way back in 2021 for this to be replaced within the next 4 years because this amenities block was almost 50 years old. Some of the metal in it had rusted out. It was basically past its use-by date. It didn't have disabled access. It didn't have a dedicated disabled toilet. So it was decided that in the replacement, which was normally scheduled for that, we'd actually go to tender specifically for 3D printing technology to be used in this. The budget way back in 2021 was $300,000. It was put aside for that. Building material costs and the costs of building in general had gone up quite dramatically, so we thought it was going to be maybe 30%, sometimes maybe even 50% dearer than that now. So we had that basic expectation in our mind. We put that out to tender. We awarded the tender to a company called Contour 3D, and the cost of that was $322,000, which was obviously well within what we thought it would be and much cheaper actually than we thought it could possibly have been than using traditional printing methods. So the price was right. The time frame, they could start at a certain time frame, which seemed within the realm of what it would be if we went out to traditional methods. And then when they came and set up, they literally set up the gantry on one weekend. They started the printing. A few days later, the printing was finished. They packed up the gantry and went home. So it was quite incredible in terms of the speed of the actual construction.
That's incredible. And so what's the next step then? So you talked about getting approvals and that kind of thing. Are we at a stage now where they can be approved for residential use?
Yeah, we had our planning staff go through and work through that with the state government. And if someone put in an application today to build a house using 3D printing technology within certain parameters, normal planning parameters, yes, all else being equal, our staff have the ability to approve that, to assess that first of all, to make sure that it does still apply to all the building standards, all the building regulations, and then they have the ability to approve that given all those boxes are still ticked off, if you like. So yes, it could be we could have a 3D printed house. The estate that we have got these 4 dedicated blocks for in terms of that council resolution, the actual estate isn't ready to be built on yet, but once that's ready, then we'll be going out to the community and saying, these 4 blocks are dedicated to 3D printed housing. The reason we went with the amenities block to begin with was we wanted to make sure the community felt comfortable, because some people in the community may not have wanted to move into a house or even buy a house that was printed with 3D technology. But if they see something relatively simple built, i.e. a toilet block, then we think the community will be more comfortable with the concept of a 3D printed building. And from there, I think people would be okay moving into a house that was printed using 3D technology. And it was a spectator sport. The construction of this, for the few days that the company was here printing this, we had a construction fence around the construction, as you'd imagine, but the people that were coming along, lining up, watching, viewing the 3D printing, asking questions of the people that were doing the work on it, it was quite incredible to see how many people were interested.
What do you think's the way forward? Is it something that you think councils would invest in owning their own 3D printers and gantries and all of that, or is it something that you think you would bring contractors in and those sort of organisations would engage with organisations like Dubbo Regional Council?
One of the great challenges for any council is to make sure you stick to the knitting as much as possible. I don't really think it would be sensible, but some councils might go down this path, but I don't think it would be sensible to become a builder. What I do think is sensible is that if you've got infrastructure that you need to have built, and in this case we needed a toilet block replaced, then going out and asking for tenders that would include or maybe exclusive tenders for 3D printing technology would make sense. Some councils, I know around the state, there are some councils that do own some buildings. They might actually own some residential buildings. They might rent some of those out. I'm not saying that councils should rush out there and start building their own estates and become their own builders. That might be a solution in some areas. But I think being open to the idea so that when you've got housing being constructed and encouraging organisations to construct housing, letting organisations know that they could come in if they've got 3D printing technology to build housing quicker, and knowing there is the demand for it. And that's the main thing. If I'm a builder, if I'm a developer, I want to know that whatever I build is going to be sold or is going to be rented out if that's my model. And knowing you're going to a city that's got high demand for people wanting to be in that city, that gives you a much greater feeling of comfort. But also knowing that you're involved with a council that's progressive, that's innovative, and knowing that the community is accepting of that, that encourages those builders to come along. So I imagine that we'll see lots of builders come along and use this technology in the future. And we actually had local builders that are involved in traditional construction methods. Many of those came along and talked to these particular companies that are doing 3D printing. Some of those might buy their own gantries, some of those might set themselves up, or they might contract out to some of these specialised companies, because a lot of these companies, they're not builders, although they are doing building work. They're computer operators, or they're working with materials, coming up with that mixture of concrete that's liquid enough to come out through a nozzle, that's not too liquid that it doesn't collapse when it goes into the actual wall itself, and then sets at a very high strength. And the particular strength of this toilet block is 50 MPa. Now, if you consider that a normal slab that is built for a building might only be, say, 20 MPa, maybe even 30 MPa, then 50 MPa is very high-strength concrete. That's part of the secret sauce for any of these companies that are developing 3D printing technology.
And obviously we are experiencing a skills shortage. As you mentioned, there's a lack of tradesmen and builders. Putting these in place still will require tradies to some extent, but I guess we could see a real shift in the industry towards the need for electricians, plasterers, and people to finish building places like this.
And this still needed local tradies to do the plumbing, obviously, as the toilet. So an important part of that is the plumbing. We still needed the walls inside built. They weren't 3D printed. They were still traditional walls in a cubicle as such. And you still needed a roof put over the top. That's not 3D printed. That's more a traditional construction method. So you're right. You still need other tradies. It's not as if you're going to do a tradesman out of a job. You might do some brickies out of a job, but there's no reason that brickies who are involved with bricks and concrete couldn't also obtain jobs in this type of technology and work for companies that are doing 3D printing. So yesterday they might have been putting up bricks, today they're putting up a concrete wall, the same sort of concept. But it is hard to get tradespeople now, it's hard to get brickies. So when you're building something like this, you might have had a lengthy delay waiting on the time frame to get bricklayers, and then it would have definitely taken them a lot longer than a few days to actually lay the bricks for this particular building.
Great. Anything else you wanted to add?
It's exciting technology. Absolutely. I think it was exciting for the community of Dubbo. It's actually going to be now a tourist attraction. And that sounds a bit silly that a toilet block's a tourist attraction, but we're still getting visitors from various locations. And I don't think they're coming to Dubbo just for the 3D printed toilet, but once they're here and they hear about it, they want to go and look at it. I've had ministers already who have been in Dubbo, ministers from the state government who have gone along and looked at it to see whether this might help solve the housing crisis across the state. I actually think it's going to be a tourist attraction in its own right. And our staff have already had detailed conversations with 10 councils from around the state to tell them the process and how they might go about it in their council. So there's no doubt about it. It's something that people are looking to the future.
There was no temptation to put the first one in Dunedoo.
There was some talk several years ago that Dunedoo was going to have a big dunny, and that idea was knocked on the head in the end. I didn't mind the idea, actually. Dunedoo's not in our LGA, but I didn't mind the idea of a big dunny in Dunedoo, but maybe a big 3D printed dunny in Dunedoo would be a great tourist attraction.
Could be the go. Hey, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Mayoral Memo with Matthew Dickinson from Dubbo Regional Council.